for his Passion Week, which that week ends with his burial. If you talk about Saturday to Saturday, or Saturday to Friday, I guess technically, and then you've got his resurrection and his ascension. So this is a chronological framework for the life of Christ that we've looked at a few times. And if we were to look at it in terms of the chart that we've seen a few times by PowerPoint, it would look something like this. And of course, these phases are largely related to geographical areas. And it really helps to know the key provinces or key regions, I guess that's a better word, the key regions of the area where Jesus lived and ministered. You can see Judea, of course, right there on the left toward the bottom. That's where Jerusalem is. That would be the hub or the capital of Jewry, so to speak. To the right or to the east, you can see Perea, what in the King James Version is called across the Jordan. If you work your way up north of Perea, you can see Decapolis, Decapolis, 10 cities. This was a Greek area, 10 Greek cities, largely Gentile. This is where you had the pigs, for example, the swine. If you cross west, you can see Samaria. And Samaria, of course, is what divided Judea from Galilee. And north of Samaria is Galilee, and this would be where Jesus spent much of his 3.5 year ministry. And then to the west of Galilee, you can see Phoenicia, which would be Tyre and Sidon. For example, one of the miracles that Jesus did was for the Syrophoenician woman, her daughter who was demon-possessed, and that would have been in the area of Phoenicia. So these 6 areas are largely where the ministry of our Lord took place. And there's this gives you a little idea of the duration of the time periods of each of those phases. And I put up here A.T. Robertson, who's the old classic. I put up here Harold Hoehner, who is a more modern conservative author. He passed away just a few years ago. Very conservative man. Did his dissertation on the life of Herod Antipas, and so did a lot of chronological work related to the time of Christ. And you can see that there's a couple key differences. One is the date that's being chosen, whether it's 26 or more like 30, 31 or so. Another difference is the length of the early Judean ministry, or the length of the Great Galilean. And you can see that Robertson and Hoehner disagree a little bit on the length of those two phases, but everything else is about the same. The around Galilee time, the later Judean, the later Perean, the Passion Week, of course, the resurrection and ascension, those are all largely the same. And so there's just a little bit of disagreement over the exact length of the early Judean and the Great Galilean ministries. And that's because we don't have enough chronological markers in the Gospels to maybe be as dogmatic as we would like to be. What I thought might be helpful is to take those 7 phases of Jesus' ministry and think about them in light of the Gospel of Luke. We did this a few weeks ago with the Gospel of Mark, but you can actually take the Gospels and work through them and keeping those 7 phases in mind. I find it works best to have a Bible and to have a harmony of the Gospels open, and then the harmony of the Gospels will help you know when a phase ends for that Gospel. So for example, just working through here really quickly, this is all the references here would be to the Gospel of Luke, unless otherwise indicated. So you've got the early Judean ministry, and I've got my Bible open here. So Luke chapter 3, verse 1 is the chronological marker where he introduces the early Judean ministry of Christ in the sense of he introduces the ministry of John the Baptist. He actually begins before technically the beginning of Jesus' ministry. He tells you the beginning of John's ministry. And then by verse 16 or so of chapter 3, you're beginning to transition. He's talking about the Messiah coming. And then verse 21 is when Jesus is actually baptized. That's a part of Jesus. Really, that's the first event of Jesus' early Judean ministry. Luke will then give us in chapter 4, he talks about the temptation of Christ. He and Matthew are the only ones that spell out in detail these three climaxing temptations. And then chapter 4, verse 13 is when the devil ends a temptation and departs from him for a season. And then verse 14 says, and Jesus returned in the power of the Spirit into Galilee. And it's between verses 13 and 14 that you have the rest of Jesus' Jesus' early Judean ministry. It's between verses 13 and 14 in Luke 4 that you have, for example, the first cleansing of the temple. You have the miracle at Cana. You have the conversation with Nicodemus. All of these things are taking place chronologically in between verses 13 and verse 14 in the Gospel of Luke. And then in chapter 4, verse 14, that's when Luke now picks up the story and he's going to hone in on the great Galilean ministry. So the synoptics don't really give us as full a picture of the early Judean ministry of Christ as the Gospel of John does. It's almost like John, who's writing a few decades later, is looking back and he's filling in some of the gaps, and he says, okay, there's been some records already written of the life of Christ. I'm going to fill in some of the gaps, and he fills in some of the gaps of the early Judean phase. But Luke does pick up the great Galilean, and chapter 4, verse 14 is going to be where Jesus goes to Galilee. Luke doesn't tell us about the trip through Samaria and the Samaritan woman. He takes Christ right to Galilee and just launches right in to what happened at Nazareth. And then if you page through your Bible, chapter 4, all of that is the great Galilean. Chapter 5, all of that is the great Galilean. Chapter 6 is the Galilean. Chapter 7, chapter 8. And then as you come into chapter 9, as he calls his disciples together, you can see the beginning there. And then chapter 9, verse 7 references Herod the Tetrarch, mentions the fact that that Herod had John beheaded. And again, that's the ending point of the great Galilean ministry. That death of John the Baptist is what, when news reached Christ of that seems to be part of what compelled him or impressed him or moved him or convinced him that it was time for him to begin a more private time of ministry with his disciples. But you can see that Luke does reference the death of John the Baptist. He doesn't give as much detail as Mark does. Mark gives more detail on the death of John the Baptist than any of the other Gospels. But Luke does mention it. And so that brings an end to the great Galilean. And you can see by chapter 9, verse 10, this is where it says, and he took them and went aside privately into a desert place belonging to the city called Bethsaida. And that's the taking his disciples, trying to get away privately. And of course, it doesn't work completely because you've got the crowds that follow him, and you've got the feeding of the 5,000, which is the only miracle recorded in all four Gospels, and is a miracle that is 1 year before his crucifixion. 1 year before his crucifixion is the feeding of the 5,000. It was a very significant miracle. It seemed to be a miracle in which he presented himself both on a Jewish stage and a Gentile stage later in the feeding of the 4,000, really as the Messiah, the bread of life, the one who would give his flesh for mankind. But that's the event that is at the beginning of this time around Galilee. And then Luke's record of the around Galilee time is actually quite short. He doesn't give a whole lot of detail. Chapter 9, verse 10. Then he, of course, tells the feeding of the 5,000. But chapter 9, verse 51 is where you have one of these, again, this transition. And Luke, probably more than any of the other Gospels, is the one who repeatedly speaks of Jesus heading to Jerusalem. And the next time you read through Luke, if you want to try to mark this, every time you see Luke saying, and Jesus was headed toward Jerusalem, and we must go up to Jerusalem, or Jesus set his face for Jerusalem. He repeats this over and over. We're going to see in just a minute a little bit of that. But it's chapter 9, verse 51 is where you've got a transition. It's like, okay, the time around Galilee has come to an end, and Jesus is beginning to set his face toward Jerusalem and what is to happen in Jerusalem. And again, this is about 6 months before his crucifixion. The around the Galilee time is about a period of 6 months. And so it's at the end of that 6-month period that Jesus, something in his spirit indicates, okay, it is time that I begin to shift my focus toward heading up toward Jerusalem. And so chapter 9:51 is when he heads toward Jerusalem, and he goes into what's called the later Judean phase of his ministry. Luke does record some things about this, and this would be chapter 10, chapter 11, chapter 12. All of these chapters are recording incidents that took place during Jesus' later Judean ministry. And it's in chapter 13, verse 21. That's probably where the later Judean ministry ends. And this is probably where you have this Jesus and the Feast of the Dedication. I may have written this wrongly here on the screen, I'm not sure. But the Feast of Dedication, this is what brings the later Judean ministry to an end. And probably chapter 13, verse 22, this introduces us to the fifth stage when he's going through cities and villages, teaching and journeying toward Jerusalem. And you can see that phrase there again. He's going toward Jerusalem. And this is probably now in the later Berrey period, or the Berrey phase of Jesus' ministry. And so the rest of chapter 13, chapter 14, chapter 15, chapter 16, chapter 17, 18, all of these are taking place, to the best of our knowledge, are taking place during this the Berrey stage, the later Berrey stage of Jesus' ministry. And then you come and through and scattered in here are places where it mentions that Jesus is heading to Jerusalem. So like 17:11, it came to pass as he went to Jerusalem. Chapter 18, verse 31, behold, we go up to Jerusalem. So all along, it's like his face. Luke just keeps pointing us. Jesus is going to Jerusalem. But you come into chapter 19, and you see, for example, in verse 1, he entered and passed through Jericho. Actually, you could go back to 18:35. It came to pass that as he was come nigh unto Jericho. Okay, well, why is he near Jericho? Well, because, and I'm going to go backwards here a little bit, because when you go from Perea, if you can see Perea, just east of the Jordan River, to go from Perea to Jerusalem or to Bethany, you have to go through Jericho. Jericho is on the road from Perea to Jerusalem. And so when you come into Luke chapter 19, like Luke 18, even 35, Jericho, chapter 19, verse 1, Jericho, Zacchaeus, the reason Jesus is in Jericho is because his face is set toward Jerusalem. He's leaving Perea, and he's working his way up that mountain road. And some of you have been with us as we took the bus and kind of wound our way up. And you go up to Jerusalem. That's why the order you have in the gospel here. And by chapter 19, 27, you've got Jesus is getting near Jerusalem, and you can see that in chapter 19, verse 28, when it says, and when he had thus spoken, he went before, ascending up to Jerusalem, and it came to pass when he was come nigh to Bethpage, or Bethphage, and Bethany at the mount called the Mount of Olives, and then the story continues. But that's as he arrives in Jerusalem for his Passion Week, and that's chapter 19, verse 28 and 29 in the Gospel of Luke. And then the Passion Week is everything that takes place. You've got chapter 19, which is the triumphal entry, and you've got 20 and 21 and the teaching of Christ and the various incidents in Christ's time in that week there. And then, of course, you've got his betrayal and his arrest, and you've got chapter 23, and he dies in chapter 23, and by the end of chapter 23, they're burying him, and that's the end of the Passion Week. And then, of course, chapter 24 is all about the first day of the week, the day of his resurrection. And Luke actually takes us through some of the appearances. There's a lengthy story, of course, of Christ's appearance to the two on the road to Emmaus. It mentions that Jesus had appeared to Peter, but it doesn't really narrate it. It just mentions that it had happened. Then you've got his appearance to the 11, and then it takes us out past Bethany, there on the Mount of Olives, or near Bethany on the Mount of Olives, and you've got him ascending. So if you were using the Gospel of Luke, that's how you would trace your way through the 7 phases of Jesus' ministry, looking at it chronologically, the different segments as he works his way toward Jerusalem. And you can do it. We've done that with Mark. We've done that with Luke. And you could, I'm not sure I'll do this again, but you could do this with Matthew. And you could try to find the spots in Matthew where you have the transition. And again, I'd recommend A.T. Robertson's Harmony, or Thomas Gundry, I think it's Gundry's Harmony. There's another one, I can't think of the name, I could get it to you, but there's another Harmony. But any of those are going to help you in mapping out the signposts for each of the Gospels where one phase ends and another phase begins. It just kind of gives you an idea of what's happening in Christ's ministry as he works his way toward the cross. Let's change gears entirely. And so a little mental break here. And let's go back then to where we left off a couple weeks ago. And one of the things, of course, this is words and works of Christ. And one of the things we need to do is talk about parables here at some point. So this will probably be our last time talking about miracles. I think I sent Brother Yuchai my list of the 37 miracles that I had compiled using harmonies and things like that. And I came up with 37 specific miracles recorded in the 4 Gospels. And, again, it depends on how you count, what you include. I don't include the times when Jesus knew information, when he knew what was in somebody's heart, for example. Kind of view that as part of his nature. But anyway, this is, okay, thank you, Brother Yuchai, for that link there. So I come up with 37 of these miracles, and you'll see that in other Bibles. Sometimes you'll see 40, sometimes you'll see 35. Again, it depends on how you count. And I tried to arrange them in chronological order to get an idea of the order of these. But one of the things we did last week, and I feel like this is helpful, is to think through how do you approach a miracle to identify its major truth. Because I think sometimes we struggle. We see the story, we enjoy the story. Some of us have been exposed to the story so long that maybe it doesn't excite us as much as it could or should. But one of the challenges is how do you what's the major truth of a miracle? And I think a key is trying to look for the major truth, not just looking at it as, okay, how can I get a 3-point sermon out of this, but maybe even starting by saying, okay, what's the major truth of this thing? And then once you capture the major truth, then go back through and say, okay, what kind of stepping stones can I lay down in terms of an outline that will lead my audience step by step to see with me the major truth of a miracle? And I don't know, you have different ways to do it. You could almost use these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 here almost, and you could almost say, okay, let's start. We're going to look at a miracle today in our Sunday school, and let's start with the context, and let's talk about the context, and then what are the main characters in this miracle? Who do you think is the main character? What is it that makes somebody a main character? And then you could say, okay, now in a miracle, very important is the dialogue in that story. Dialogue is one of God's ways of revealing what's happening in a story. And especially the first uttered words in the story, those words are what moves you in a certain direction or moves the story in a certain direction. Then number 4, okay, why don't we look through the plot? And let's think about how the action moves through the story. What's the tension? What's the problem? in the story. The story's resolving. And then number 5, the conclusion is maybe more important than we sometimes realize, but because that's where the author will give his perspective sometimes, or he'll give the audience his response. And he records that because he wants us to think about that response. Either he wants us to respond that way, or maybe he doesn't want us to respond that way. It depends on the conclusion of the story. Or he'll give us his perspective on the story. So these are 5 elements of stories, and I feel like that if I work through these 5 things, that by the time I'm done and I kind of synthesize these, I can come up with an idea of what the major truth of that miracle is. And of course, that's the major truth that we want to take home with us, or personalize, and then share with the people around us. So I've been blessed by looking at different miracles and asking myself, okay, what is the unique truth of this miracle? And not just trying to import other information that I have, that I know about the Bible, but trying to say, okay, what's the unique truth that this miracle is presenting about Christ? And of course, many of these are about Christ, because the miracles were signs. So I thought it would be fun tonight to tackle a miracle. And this is the miracle in Mark chapter 8. And what's fascinating about this miracle is that this is where it takes Jesus 2 tries to heal a blind man. So let's go to Mark 8. I'm in Luke here. Let me work my way back to Mark 8 here. Well, let's go to Mark 8. And I don't know if you ever given much thought to this miracle. This miracle is only found in Mark's gospel. It's not found in the other gospels. So chapter 8, verse 22. I'll just read this, and we can get the words here in our mind. So verse 22, and he cometh to Bethsaida, and they bring a blind man unto him, and besought him to touch him. And he took the blind man by the hand and led him out of the town. Kind of interesting. And when he had spit on his eyes and put his hands upon him, he asked him if he saw aught. And that's the first implied conversation, or the first uttered. In some translations, they put it more as direct discourse, as actual dialogue. So verse 24, and he, the man, looked up and said, I see men as trees walking, which would make you think that maybe this man was not born blind, because he had seen people before, and something wasn't right in what he was seeing at that point. And he looked up and said, I see men as trees walking. Verse 25, after that, he, Jesus, put his hands again upon his eyes and made him look up. And he was restored and saw every man clearly, or everything clearly. And he sent him away to his house, saying, neither go into the town, nor tell it to any in the town. Of course, the unusual thing about this miracle is that it took Jesus 2 tries to heal this blind man. So why? Earlier today, I was trying to think of, okay, what would be some options? Why 2 tries? Okay, well, one idea would be Jesus did not have enough power. What do you think about that one? Number 2, the man did not have enough faith. Jesus was teaching something about his power, that it can either be released quickly or slowly, in an instant, or as a process. Or number 4, Jesus was using the miracle as a platform to teach another truth. Now, there may be some other options, but, well, in reply to number one, and kind of in reply to number three, everywhere else, everyone else in the book of Mark that Jesus touched was instantly healed. And I put the references there, and I don't know that we need to look at all of those, but if you were to look at those references, you would see in every one of those there's a healing, and in every one of those it uses a word like touch. Many of the verses use the word touch that's used here. Every one of them, there's healing. Every one of them, there's touching. They touch Jesus, typically. And every time they are healed instantly. So obviously, and of course, I think we under our grid of faith, obviously, it's not that Jesus did not have enough power. I'm not sure that number three is possible, but again, every time somebody touches Jesus, or he touches them in the book of Mark, they are healed instantly. I'm not sure that a lesson on his power being quick or slow or instant or a process, I'm not sure what that would be communicating. Number two, I just don't see anything in the passage that indicates the man doesn't have enough faith. I mean, he follows Jesus out of the village. He allows Jesus to spit on his eyes. Would you let somebody spit on your eyes? I mean, he follows Jesus out. He lets Jesus spit on his eyes. He lets Jesus touch him. So I'm not.
Dr. Berrey.
Yes.
But he can't see. He's blind.
He's blind.
Yeah, he can't see that Jesus was going to spit on his eyes.
Well, once Jesus does it, right?
Yeah.
he might have heard the sound of the spitting or something, right? Okay. Who knows?
Okay.
Good point there. Thank you. So I guess personally, I'm not sure about number two. I don't feel like there's anything in the passage. I mean, Jesus doesn't bring up the man's faith. So I'm looking for clues in the text is what I'm looking for. And I don't see anything in the text that makes me think, okay, the problem is this man's faith. So which makes me wonder, I'm wondering about number four. Just to tell you where I'm headed here. That I kind of think that the reason it took Jesus 2 tries was that Jesus is using the miracle as a platform to teach truth. And we see that in other miracles. Like we saw that in the healing of the paralytic. That was a platform to teach that Jesus could forgive sin. So we've seen this before, that a miracle is a platform in order to teach something about Jesus himself, or a lesson that he is trying to teach. So I'm leaning toward number 4, and we're going to work that way, and I'll show you. I think by the time we're done, I think it'll be interesting. The miracle here actually resembles another miracle that's in the chapter before. And in this one, in both, someone has a physical handicap. In both, people bring the person to Jesus. In both, they ask Jesus to touch the person. In both, Jesus takes the person away to a more private place. In both, Jesus heals the person. In both, Jesus asks the person not to broadcast what happened. In chapter 7, in the conclusion, everybody exclaims how well Jesus does everything. And then you come to chapter 8, and here's a very similar, in some ways, a similar miracle. And instead of healing the man the first time, it's like it takes twice. So why? Well, this is where I would say, okay, this is a fascinating miracle. And this is where I would want to work through, again, these ideas for a miracle. How do you get at the major truth of a miracle? And so I would consider the setting or context. I'm going to come back to that because to me that's the key in this miracle. I'm going to identify the main characters. I'm going to think, okay, well, obviously you've got, who are the characters? You've got Jesus, of course. You've got this blind man. You've got the people who bring the blind man to Jesus. I would say it's clear that your two main characters would be Jesus and the blind man. The dialogue, if you include verse 23 when Jesus asks him, if you include that, there are some translations that'll make that, again, more direct discourse. He asked him, do you see anything? The word ought is a little tiny Greek word that means something or anything. Do you see anything is what Jesus asked him. He asked him if he saw anything. Anything at all. And that's really your first dialogue. Do you see anything? And the man says, well, I see, but what I see is men like trees walking. And so what that dialogue reveals is that Jesus' healing touch in verse 23 didn't quite fix the problem. The man still doesn't see correctly. His eyes are open, so to speak. He's seeing now. The organ is working, in a sense, but he's not seeing clearly. So that's a part of the dialogue, and the dialogue, of course, goes on. If I move to number 4, the plot, I'm looking for, okay, what's happening in this miracle? What's the tension? And I would say part of the tension, I think, is the very fact that, and the dialogue kind of helps us here, is that here Jesus is healing a man, and every time in Mark that Jesus touches somebody or somebody touches him, they are instantly healed. And here's this blind man, and Jesus goes to all this effort, if I could put it this way. He leads him out of town. He spits on his eyes. He touches his eyes. I mean, Jesus could just talk. He could just say, "Be healed," or "Be open," and his eye. He doesn't need to do all of this. But after he does all of this, verse 24, the man still doesn't see correctly. And so I would just, to me, that's like your tension. It's like, okay, so why is it different this time? Why doesn't the man see correctly the first time? So I think that's part of the tension, the problem that the story is resolving. And then conclusion. The conclusion, verse 25 and 26 in a way too, but is that Jesus puts his hands again on his eyes. So Jesus persists. He doesn't just leave the man where he is. He persists in finishing the job. And when the man looks, he sees every, and honestly in Greek, the word man is not in the text. It's just the word for every or all. And it can be translated every man, or it can be translated everything. And you could literally say, and he saw everything clearly, or every man clearly. You could translate it either way. Okay, so somebody's got an interesting comment. So he noted the healing process. Okay, so it kind of doesn't, Luke is a doctor. To mark anything is quick. Okay, interesting comment. So thanks for commenting there. I'm not sure what to say. I think the odd thing is the fact that it didn't happen. Again, it didn't happen right away. You would assume that the first time Jesus would, based on Mark, any time somebody is touched, they're healed. We're gonna, but I think you'll see we're going somewhere here. So anyway, that's what I would think through this. I'm saying, okay, I'm looking for the answer to why. Why the two tries? And obviously the miracle works its way to a conclusion where the man does finally see. So here's what I would do at this point, because the miracle's rather short. I'm not necessarily fully satisfied. I feel like, okay, maybe there's something that I'm not getting. And this is where I would say we want to hit the context pretty hard. Mark is the only gospel that records this miracle, and what's the setting and what's the context. And that's what I didn't really talk about at all yet, because I want to lead us there now. What is the context here? I would say the context is the key to this miracle. If you look, and I don't know how much to go back here, I don't want to overly elongate this, but if you kind of look back through, like chapter 7 and 8, maybe even chapter 6. Like, for example, chapter 6 is beginning in verse 14. You've got King Herod. And I'm starting here because he is going to come up in the more immediate context in chapter 8. So this is Mark's account of where Herod beheads John the Baptist. This is actually, no gospel records this in the detail like Mark does. I'm not sure why that is, but it's just a fact. So then you've got verse 31 of Mark 6, and this is where Jesus says, okay, come apart and let's rest a while. And then this is where the people follow him. And this is where verse 36 launches us into the feeding of the 5,000. So you got the feeding of the 5,000, and then you've got chapter 7, and you've got discussion with the Pharisees. Then you've got, in verse 24, you've got the Syrophoenician woman. And then chapter 7, verse 31, he departs from the coast of Tyre and Sidon. And chapter 8, verse 1, he is in the area of Decapolis. We know that from chapter 7, verse 31, through the midst of the coast of Decapolis. So he's in that 10 cities area. In chapter 8, verse 1, so he's in this Gentile area. And again, there's a multitude of people. And he finds out there's 7 loaves. Chapter 8, verse 5, he feeds the multitude. And when they're done, they have as many baskets left as loaves that they started with, and he sends the people away. And then chapter 8, verse 10, verse 11, here come the Pharisees. They begin to question him. They've got a sign. They want a sign. And of course, probably many of them had already, they probably had seen, or no doubt had heard, the feeding of the 5,000, feeding of the 4,000, so they'd seen a sign. There's no reason for the question. And then verse 14, the disciples had forgotten to take bread, neither had they in the ship with them more than 1 loaf, so they had 1 loaf of bread. They're talking about that. Maybe they feel guilty because they didn't provide, didn't take foresight, whatever, concerned about the lack. Verse 15, take heed, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and of the leaven of Herod. That's really unusual. We expect Pharisees and Sadducees, but Pharisees and Herod, it's kind of an unusual combination. They reasoned among themselves, saying, it is because we have no bread. When Jesus knew it, he saith unto them, why reason ye because you have no bread? Perceive ye not yet, neither understand? Okay, so here's these words. Don't you understand? Don't you perceive? Have your heart, have ye your heart yet hardened? Verse 18, having eyes, see ye not? Having ears, hear ye not? Do ye not remember? And then he reminds them, verse 19, reminds them of the 5,000 feeding. Reminds them, verse 20, 4,000 feeding. And he said unto them, how is it that ye do not understand? That's verse 21. And then verse 22 is our miracle. So leading into this miracle is this discussion of Jesus with his disciples, where he has, he fed 5,000 people, then he fed 4,000 people, and the disciples still don't really get it fully. And he says things like, you mean you don't understand? You mean you don't have eyes to see? You don't have ears to hear? You mean you don't understand after all of this? And then they bring a blind man to him. And it takes him 2 tries. And then if you go past this healing of the blind man, in verse 27, this is where Jesus takes his disciples. He's in the area of Caesarea Philippi, and this is where he elicits from them whom he is. Who do people say that I am? They confess him to be the Christ, and then he begins to teach them what that means. So here's what I think is happening. I think that the slowness of the man's recovery, if I can put it that way, it's a better way to say that, but I think that's picturing the dullness of the disciples. In other words, the 2 tries is deliberate. This is not a lack in Jesus' power, obviously. This is not a lack of the man's faith. Nothing in the text indicates a lack of faith. What you do have in the text, what you do have in the context, immediate context, is Jesus, if I can use the word, kind of a holy frustration with his disciples who have seen these amazing miracles, and yet they still don't fully understand. And he gets on them a little bit. You mean you don't understand? You mean you don't have eyes? I mean, having eyes you don't see? Having ears you don't hear? And then you got this miracle where Jesus, touches the man and he says, "Do you see anything? Do you see something?" What Jesus, and if he sees anything. And the man says, "Well, I see, but it's not quite right." And then Jesus touches him again, and the man goes away seeing every man, or could be seeing everything clearly. He goes from seeing something, just anything, to seeing everything clearly. And you've got Jesus persisting until the blind man did not just see something, but everything clearly. Now, I put a lot more in here, and maybe that's about enough. But I think the point is Jesus had shown the disciples some pretty amazing signs. They had seen some things, and they needed to see everything clearly. They needed to be aware. They needed to be aware of should be an of there. They needed to be aware of the voices of their age, which included the influential stance of people like the Pharisees and Herod. The disciples should have understood more than they did, but Jesus will keep working with them until they understood everything clearly. I think you see that as you move past the miracle, and now you have, this is where Jesus launches into his teaching. Once they confess him to be Messiah, he launches into the cross, the teaching on the cross. Chapter 8, Mark chapter 8, Mark chapter 9, Mark chapter 10, these are the first times in Jesus' ministry where he clearly lays out to his disciples that the Messiah has to die. I mean, he's alluded, destroy this body in 3 days and I'll raise it again. Destroy this temple. But this is the first time he's clearly laid this out for his disciples, the teaching on the cross. So he's working with them until they, he's going to keep at it until they get things clear. And of course, it's going to even be after his ascension before everything really comes together. And to me, it's amazing. The very next thing recorded in the Gospels is the confession of Messiah, followed by the teaching of Messiah's death, then followed by the Messiah's transfiguration. So you go from this miracle, then to confession of who he is, then Jesus teaches on the cross, chapter 8, verse 31. You got Peter, who can't stand the thought of a cross for the Messiah. And then you've got Jesus' comments on that. And then chapter 9, you've got the transfiguration. There is a deliberate process in what Jesus is doing as he's working with his disciples and trying to bring them to a clear understanding. Why the leaven of the Pharisees and Herod? I just put some different things that I'd read or thought. I think there's probably a little bit in a truth in some of these. Herod will later ask for a sign. This idea of the signs. They both wanted to see a sign. They both had heard and seen signs, yet seeing the signs did not bring them to faith. So just seeing a sign doesn't mean that you're going to believe. Both Pharisees and Herod had wrong conceptions of a Messiah. They wanted a kingdom free of Romans, but for the wrong reasons. I think especially the Pharisees. Herod, in a sense, probably wanted to be king of a kingdom. Related to number one, and to me this is interesting. Herod was mentioned before the two feedings, the Pharisees after. Here were two major signs of who Jesus was, yet both would not walk away from these signs with understanding. Jesus was warning the disciples that they needed to be careful that they not walk away without understanding, as their concern about only having one loaf of bread suggested. They had seen him do miracles, but they were not applying to the situation what they knew about him. And so again, you've got Herod feeding Pharisees, and so they're all there in this context, which is why Jesus is bringing up this leaven of the Pharisees and Herod. And so I think you can put it all together, that they had failed to understand who Jesus was from the signs they had heard or seen. Herod had heard. The Pharisees had seen. And honestly, there is hypocrisy. Here are Pharisees who had seen signs, they had seen power, and they just keep asking for signs. It's really hypocrisy. They do not want to believe. That's why they're not believing. And they had failed to see him because they were looking for the wrong kind of Messiah. Jesus was not what their conception of Messiah should be. They were looking for something different. And I think this helps explain why Jesus shunned indiscriminate broadcasting of who he was. When he says, please do not share what just happened to you. It was not enough to think that he was the Messiah. People had to understand what his being the Messiah meant. And if these people who were healed, if they went and broadcasted, oh, look what happened to me, this has got to be the Messiah, people would be worked up into such a fervor over that. But they did not understand what being Messiah meant. And this is where Mark turns, and he gets past this gospel, and he elicits this confession of who he is, of who Jesus is. And then Jesus begins to explain to them, okay, the Messiah actually is going to die. He's going to suffer and die, and then he's going to be resurrected. And this is all part of his trying to explain who he is. Here in the Pharisees, they weren't willing to embrace him. They weren't willing to embrace the idea of a cross. But the way of the Messiah was the way of the cross. And the disciples had to see this clearly. And even the transfiguration served a purpose. And again, that's right after our next chapter in a miracle, giving them a glimpse of the glory of the Son of Man so they would better understand his decease. And if you look at Luke's account of the transfiguration, Luke says that they were actually discussing his departure. They were discussing his death. Here he is transfigured, and he's discussing literally the word is exodus. They were discussing his departure. And his departure by way of a cross was not because he had no glory, but rather the pathway for him, and really for us, to glory was by the way of the cross. And so I think when you put all that together, what you see is in this miracle, it's like Jesus is using this healing as a platform to illustrate on a visible level how somebody can see and yet not see correctly. Or they can understand but not understand clearly, or the problem when there is not yet clear understanding. And what you see suggested as Jesus persists in bringing this man to full eyesight, it is almost like he's picturing his disciples a little slow to understand, slow to fully see everything, but he's going to work with them in bringing them to a full understanding of who he is. And eventually, when his Spirit would come, they would come to the point where they too would see everything clearly. And so I think that's what you have in this really fascinating miracle. Well, there were some questions here. I saw something come up here, and let me see if I can get to that. Okay, got it. Yeah, so we're working through Mark. And yeah, anybody have any comments or questions? So for me, a key in this miracle is thinking again through those 5 things, but then really going back to the context and saying, okay, what's the context of this miracle? And I found that to be very helpful. Okay, good, thank you. Okay, well, so that's probably all we're going to do with miracles, and we'll see what next week holds. So we might start parables, or might do a little bit of an overview of the great Galilean ministry. So we'll see here how my studies go this next week.
Any reason why he bring the blind man out of the town?
From what I recall, this is the 3rd time that Jesus has done something a little more privately. He did it with Jairus' daughter. He did it with the miracle in chapter 7. And he did it here. And my guess is that it's related to his instructions to the man not to go back to the town and talk about it. I think he wanted a little more private context. He was not trying to create a show, and what he did not want or did not need in a certain sense were people super hyped up that he was the Messiah, but not understanding what that meant.
Okay.
Because the Jewish idea of a Messiah was a king who's going to bring political deliverance and rescues from the Romans. And to work that into a fury was morally dangerous. People had to understand what it meant that he was the Messiah. That's my guess. To give a little more privacy to the miracle.
Okay.
He does something similar in chapter 7. Like verse 33, he took him aside from the multitude. Kind of a similar thing.
Dr. Berrey, he
Yes,
took
ma'am.
him aside from the multitude. The multitude willingly left him aside.
Well, I don't know. That's a good... evidently, Jesus tried. And so to some extent, that's what he did. But yeah, I mean, I think if I were there, I would have wanted to follow and see what was going to happen. So
Jesus led the blind man out of town, but it's not stated that no one followed him. No one
true.
followed them.
Yeah, I don't think we should picture that it's just the 2 of them. But I think we should picture that Jesus is trying to get away from the center, in a sense, get away from a hub of people as much. And I guess I would say to get as much privacy as possible. But I'm not sure that we should picture it as just 2 people. He's going to have his disciples probably. He's going to have other people that are watching. But he is trying to get a measure of privacy. And, from Jairus' daughter, we do know that there were times when Jesus put other people out. So there were times when he did speak with authority and say, okay, you go out, you come in, and here's the people who's going to be there for this time. So, don't know.
But in Jairus' daughter's case, they were in a room.
Right.
He had the he had control over the situation, so to speak. But this is
yeah,
out
a
in the
little more.
open, isn't it? Yeah.
But doesn't it, I don't think Mark says it, but doesn't it say in one of the Gospels that there were some people that he put out? I think, so I mean, I agree with you that there was a room. So, but I mean, even given that, I think he actually, you know, asked some people to leave, in other words.
Yes. He did. I remember that.
Okay,
And
yeah.
I think he closed the door, I think, if I remember.
You know, I'm looking at Mark and I just don't see it, but I could run it down. Anyway, yeah, it's a good question. So again, I mean, I think one of the issues that Jesus, you know, obviously that Jesus had was the issue of privacy. You know, I mean, the multitudes were watching. I mean, obviously, I mean, it was fascinating. It was astonishing. They'd never seen anything like this, ever. So you did have the multitudes and the balance between doing these miracles and at the same time trying to keep the movement from getting whipped up into a political movement that would endanger his whole mission. And that's why I don't know if you ever, I'm sure you noticed, like especially in Mark, so many times when he will tell people, don't say who I am, or don't say what happened. And you're like, why? I mean, why would, you know, Jesus wants everybody to know who he is, right? Why would he say don't? And it's because of that. It's not enough to know, it's not enough to think he was Messiah. You have to know what that meant. And that was what took a deeper understanding or deeper, and that's really what Jesus tried to do in the feeding of the 5,000 and the Sermon on the Bread of Life, when he separates the men from the boys. And to hear the people follow him, and it's the miracle of the free lunch. And everybody loves a free lunch, and they follow him. And he goes, wait. He says, listen, you're following me because of what you saw. You're not following me because of what I'm teaching. And that's when he put down some pretty hard words. He said, actually, the bread I came to give is my flesh. And it's those who eat and drink my flesh, they're the ones who will have eternal life. And that's where he's trying to dig deeper than just the external understanding, and he's trying to cut to the heart. And some people walked away. Many people walked away. But they had to understand what it meant. You know, I think about in our day, sometimes you talk to some maybe more charismatic circles, and they have a very fuzzy understanding of who Jesus is or what he did. And sometimes you got to really cut through that. Do you really know who Jesus is? Do you really understand what he did on the cross? Is it more than an emotional experience to you? Because it's not enough to think he was Messiah. You've got to understand what being Messiah meant.